All right, episode 2 of the Subjective Professor podcast. And this episode, we're going to talk about whataboutism. Yeah, something that I'm seeing a lot. I'm going to share my screen with you because I am going to go um, talk about some definitions and it might get a little bit, what shall I say, a lot of information. And so I want to have it a little bit organized for you. So, yeah, so we're just going to use a little PowerPoint. So I thought about it a lot, and this whataboutism. So some people will basically use it as an accusation, like you're doing something bad, like, oh, that's whataboutism. But I think that there are two broad types, at least that I could think of, two broad categories of whataboutism, and they're conflated. In other words, they're made to seem like they are, uh, there's only one type. The first type is a deeper analysis. So someone will ask the question, what about this? As a way to engage in a deeper level, a deeper conversation. And the other way that people use whataboutism is to simply change the subject. So one thinks that one is continuing the conversation on the original topic, but in reality, the subject has changed, and so you're actually talking about something else. All right. So let's talk about the deeper analysis version. And these are just arbitrary category names that I've made up just to sort of distinguish the two. There are some technical names, and I'll bring them up here. So deeper analysis is you're going to ask, what about this, to shift the perspective for a more careful consideration. Okay, so you want to bring up, so if I were to use the example of buying a Mercedes, right? So I'm going to buy a very expensive Mercedes automobile. And so I tell someone, hey, I'm going to buy this really super expensive Mercedes. And the person could say, hey, what about the mileage? What about the purpose? What about the insurance? You know, have you thought about these things? And so someone may shift the perspective to look at a bigger, broader picture to make sure that you're making a good choice, right? So have you considered this? Have you considered that? Then there's something called the tu quoque version of what about. And a lot of people don't like tu quoque. Tu quoque is just simply Latin for you also, you too, you do that, right? So to apply it to our example here, I say, hey, I'm buying a Mercedes, and someone says to me, hey, have you considered, uh, you know, the purpose that you're going to use it for? Have you considered the mileage? Have you considered alternative choices that might be less expensive? And I say, well, you bought a Mercedes, right? And that's the tu quoque, right? So I make a statement, you start to challenge that statement by, hey, did you consider these factors? And then I don't like that line of questioning, so I say, you bought a Mercedes too. So that's the tu quoque, right? I'm going to throw it right back at you. And a lot of people will say that this is a logical fallacy, that you shouldn't do this in a discussion because you're not really answering the question, you're deflecting. But that's one way of looking at it. But if you think about it, let's just go back to the original question. So I say, well, you bought a Mercedes. And in that moment, there's a choice that needs to be made. The person who is asking, oh, did you consider the mileage? Do you consider, the insurance costs and things like that? When they hear that question or that statement, well, you bought one too, then you can say, oh, yeah, because I can afford it. I thought about these things and I decided that I could swing the cost. And so therefore I bought it. Or the person can say, yeah, uh, I couldn't afford it, and that's why it got repossessed. And I just want to make sure that you don't make the same mistake. Okay. And so you'd simply be answered that way. But obviously, if we're talking not about a Mercedes, but about, something more, something different, right? Like a criminal charge or, government policy, things like that, you can see that the person who wants to push forth a certain kind of legislation, go forward with a certain kind of policy or rule or regulation, well, they don't want to be bothered by questions for deeper analysis, because then you'll discover that maybe it's not such a great idea. And so that's why I think a lot of people will say, no, this is deflection. It's a logical fallacy. But if you think about it, if uh, one does hear the question, well, you bought a Mercedes too, and you're going to avoid answering that question, well, it could be that you're avoiding answering that charge to hide hypocrisy, right? So I can buy a Mercedes, you definitely can't, or you shouldn't, you don't deserve them, so you can have this hypocritical dynamic going on. It also could undermine whatever, uh, you know, moralistic rationale that went into that line of questioning. Have you considered this? Have you considered that? And so they don't want the focus to shift, because then they can't make that critique any longer, right? So it undermines, so to quoque, undermines moral signaling and outrage. But we have to realize that if someone says, well, you did it too, that's the moment of saying, yeah, I'm going to be a hypocrite, or no, I'm not engaging in hypocrisy. I'm just asking you to consider this a little bit uh, more deeply. And so in this way, using whataboutism in this way is actually beneficial, right? It helps people to make more careful decisions. It helps people think on a deeper level. And it also reveals potential hypocrisy or weaker arguments. This takes us to the other form of whataboutism, which is changing the subject. So a person, when they change the subject, what they are doing is they try to introduce a gotcha type situation where it looks like they're trying to bring up a similar parallel situation where you're going to be like, oh, yeah, of course, I see it now. And so therefore, buying the Mercedes is a perfectly fine decision as well. Okay, so if you a couple of examples, and it was very difficult to try to come up with a couple of examples for the Mercedes type situation, but someone might say, "You want me to ride the bus? Is that what you're saying? You want me to ride the bus?" Or, "Oh, everyone's buying a Mercedes because of the low financing, and if everyone's doing it, and I want to fit in, I don't want to be the odd person out." Or they could say, but hey, look, I'm buying quality. This is a long-term investment, which is, of course, a very silly thing to say when it comes to automobiles. And so that's one way to change the subject. So you make it seem like you're still talking about buying the Mercedes, but you've actually subtly changed the conversation so that they can't continue to ask what about, because, oh, right, I don't want you to ride the bus. Okay, yeah, so go ahead, buy the Mercedes. Um, right, okay, so another way of explaining this is moving the goalposts, right? So it might seem that you are trying to get them to look at insurance. And so if you can't swing the insurance, if you can't afford the insurance, then maybe you should buy a less expensive car. But then they shift the attention to quality or riding the bus. Then the conversation changes a little bit. But the questions are still there, right? Can you afford the insurance? Then there's another situation called special pleading. And if you're in this situation where you're like, oh, okay, I realize that probably this is a bad decision, but what I'm going to do is I'm going to make up a situation or example that is completely uh, impossible, right? So it's a hypothetical, but it's an impossible hypothetical. So you could say something like, well, I'm not buying a Rolls Royce. Well, of course you're not buying a Rolls Royce. And it's more likely than not that you are not ever going to buy a Rolls Royce. But what does that have to do with you buying the Mercedes? And so a lot of times people will come up with this unrealistic, uh, it's never going to happen hypothetical. And they're doing that to sort of end the conversation by saying, hey, at least I'm not doing that. But that never would happen anyway. And I've been in conversations like that as well, where they engage in special pleading, right? So whenever anyone does this, where they're going to change the subject uh, by using a different example or by engaging in special pleading, it's a sign that they're losing the argument. They know they're losing the argument, but they don't want to lose the argument, right? Because the goal is to win the conversation. It's a conversation, but they want to win, right? So why do people do this? Uh, why is it that people will invoke whataboutism? Um, and it's to win the discussion, right? So a person who uses whataboutism obviously will not say, oh, you're engaging in whataboutism, right? The person who is going to engage in either the first form or the second kind of whataboutism, they will hear or not the charge or the accusation of engaging in whataboutism. But both situations, it's about winning the discussion. And if you're engaging and you're trying to get someone to consider something more deeply, and someone says, hey, you're engaging in whataboutism, the reason why they're bringing that up is they want to hide their own hypocrisy. They want to hide their own subjective, narrow, weak positions and beliefs. And so this is a really bad application of accusing someone of whataboutism. So you're denying someone the ability to ask more questions. And because you are stuck with less information, with very little information, with only one side of the story, it enables outrage. And if it's you're really upset and you're angry, you're triggered, it justifies censorship. It justifies banning people. It justifies, um, deplatforming, all of these things that you see now in so-called cancel culture. But if you think about it, if you use it well, right? Oh, and then obviously there's the bad use of whataboutism, right? Where someone who doesn't want to lose, they're constantly shifting the conversation so that they don't lose, right? So they're going to try to raise gotcha type examples in order to say, well, to have the other person just give in and say, well, okay, fine, do whatever you want. So this whole thing about whataboutism, if you realize that there are two kinds, one is just simply changing goalposts and they're just shifting the discussion. They're just trying to end the conversation and drag it out so long that the other person in that conversation says, whatever, I'm tired of talking about this. And then the other person says, yay, I win. But in the proper use of whataboutism, that is to ask more questions, to bring out more subjectivities, to look at the same situation from multiple angles, to understand what the true cost of making a choice is, and then to also consider the consequences, right? Whatever happens as a result of that activity or that choice, right? Because everyone has to bear responsibility for their choices. Well, this is a good thing, right? So to ask about greater harm that might be caused, no matter how good something might sound, if the ultimate result is harm for a greater number of people, then maybe it shouldn't be engaged in. Maybe that choice shouldn't be made. So I hope that clears it up. It cleared it up for myself when I thought about it, that there are these two kinds of whataboutism. One is a positive, beneficial application of asking what about, and the other is sort of a negative one, to allow someone to feel self-righteous, to virtue signal, to be able to cancel and censor and shut down conversation. All right. Well, if you have any questions, just leave a comment on the video. Also, if you have any questions or you have ideas for future episodes, you can leave a comment, or you can send me an email at the address that you can see on the screen here, subjectiveprofessor@gmail.com. And I'll see you in the next episode.